Good evening, YouTube. Let's talk about politics and intelligence. I recently wrote this blog post, which is really a study that I did. And it's saying that conservatives aren't stupid, asterisk. And we'll get to the asterisk. The article is really replying to Richard Hanania and some other people who tend to say things like half my writings being about how conservatives are immoral, low IQ, and generally inferior to liberals. So the typical interpretation of a claim conservatives are stupid or low IQ would be that their average intelligence is about 90 or let's say they're 10 IQ below whatever the other group is. We can look at some data that does this. In here I've been looking at the GSS. So the GSS is the General Social Survey, which is a survey in the US that's been running since the mid-70s, 74 or so it looks like by the chart. And they ask questions like, what is your political ideology? And people can say things like, I'm extremely liberal, or they can say, I'm a moderate, or I'm conservative, or extremely conservative. And they can also just say, I don't know. And so you're really just looking at people's self-placement. That's what the academics call this. And if you, in the same survey, there are 10 vocabulary items. So a 10-item vocabulary test called the word sum. And the word sum supposedly, according to some study from the 1940s, correlates 0.7 or so with the full-scale intelligence. So it is a reasonable proxy for intelligence, even though it is very brief. In fact, you can find it online and take it in 5 minutes. And if you plot the average intelligence of these different political groups over time, you get this plot. And here we have all races. Later we'll get to the white people. What you really see here is that the extreme liberal group here is in the top, and it kind of was high in the mid-70s, then it kind of declined to even below average in the late 80s when maybe Reagan was in power or something like that. Then it's been rising since then. It might have a slight decline here recently. And you can see on the other hand the extreme conservative, which was down in the low 90s IQ, then it started a big rise from the mid-80s and so all the way up to until 2000, where it was almost average intelligence, and then it's been declining again since mid-2000s or so, and reaching even 90 IQ here, which is kind of impressive. So here, if you think of Hanania's claim, you can see that comparing the extremely liberal and the extremely conservative, there just seem to be a substantial gap, at least unless you're looking at the 1990s. Nowadays, there's a big gap, and there was also a big gap in the 70s. The question then is, you can ask the question in a different way. When you're talking about conservatives, you're not really just talking about the extreme conservatives. You're also talking about the regular conservatives and the people who just say they're slightly conservative. These people are nonetheless in the conservative camp. Similarly, you can talk about the people who are liberal, and these also can be collapsed. And so what we see by IQ here is that all the three liberal groups are basically average intelligence, and the two conservative groups are also more or less average intelligence. Only the extreme conservatives are kind of low intelligence, and the moderates are also somewhat below, and the people who don't know about politics are even lower. So the average of the conservatives really depends on how many people are there in this group, and this group. And usually there are not so many in the people who call themselves extreme something. And that's, you can also see that because these error bars are larger. So that means fewer people in these samples. So if we average the liberal camp and the conservative camp, you can see that the gaps actually become quite small and not so interesting. In fact, the gap is 1 point. And so when you look at the data this way, then the gap is trivial, and the liberals are essentially 100 IQ, and the conservatives here are 99. So the gap is 1 point. In this data, I have set the non-Hispanic white IQ to be 100. And so this is really in relationship to white people being average. So in that way, you can say overall, the liberals versus the conservatives, in the total population, the gap is in favor of the liberals, but it's kind of trivial and no one really cares about that. But maybe more important is that who you're voting for. And so a different way of looking at policies or politics is to say, well, you might claim you're liberal, but who do you vote for, bro? And if you do that, they don't actually ask just for voting. They ask a bunch of questions, which They change every year, making it annoying to work with. So I've looked at something easier. Which party do people identify with? And here, again, we see the average IQs by party identification. And we see more or less the opposite of before. The strong Republicans are kind of not exactly consistently, but they're generally the smartest group with somewhat above average intelligence. And then they start to decline here, just like the extreme conservatives did. And the other people are down here, and the strong Democrats had a strong gain since the mid 80s or the 80s. And now they're kind of average tier, and they've even taken over the strong Republicans. And so, although they're here, the Republicans seem to be somewhat higher. And so if we average across the years, we get this plot, which kind of looks like the mirror image before. We have the strong Republicans on average in the last whatever years, a couple of decades, being the smartest with an average intelligence of 101 or something like this. The other groups of Republicans are slightly below average. The weak Democrats are also about average, and then we have the strong Democrats and the Democrats who are kind of below average, and the independents here, they mirror the moderates group. And so here it looks like the conservatives are kind of better, especially if you compare these two extreme camps. But again, we can say that not that many people are extreme, and so if we look at all the Republican identifiers and all the Democrat identifiers, we can see that the gap is kind of small. 2.5 IQ is nothing much to write home about. Certainly it wouldn't justify any big, generalization that this group is impressively smarter than the other group. Okay, Republicans are slightly smarter if you average the data over the last 50 years or whatever, but it's not too much to be impressed about. You can say that the non-whites might be dragging down the liberals. In the US, the lefties, the non-whites, blacks, Hispanics have lower IQs on average. They tend to vote for Democrats. So maybe they're messing up the data. So let's look at the white people only. Here we go back. We do the exact same study as before, but now we're looking at ideology, and we're looking only at white people. So here we have the extremely liberal. This is now the top line, which is similar to what we had before. And the don't know people are down here, and the extreme conservatives have this like up and down that we also saw before. Though generally speaking, the liberals are above even the run-of-the-mill liberals. So here we see that the white extreme liberals are kind of high IQ. They're 107 or something like that. And the conservatives have basically 100 IQ. So there might be roughly 7 IQ advantage here to the extreme liberals. And so these would tend to be the people who are in the media. So these would be the academics and the media people. And indeed, they have IQs that approach Reddit tier, like 110 or something like this. They're not like impressive, but they're not bad, right? They're doing better, clearly. So in that sense, you could say this looks more like what Hanania is talking about. Like before, we simplify, so we say we collapse all the liberal categories into one, and we can collapse the conservatives. Now the conservatives have 100 IQ, they're basically average, and the liberals are 104, so they have an advantage of 4 points, which is even larger than the Republicans' advantage in the general population. I think anyway, let's look. Yeah, 2.5. We can also look at parties just only for white people, and here we see that unlike before, the strong Democrats are in the top. Not all the time, but they've been so the last couple of years. The data are more truncated here because there just were fewer years of data. We can see that the strong Republicans is also on decline, like we saw on the plot before. The reason the data are truncated like this is that they didn't ask about who's Hispanic and who's not in the earliest studies. They just asked, are you white? And some of these people were actually Hispanics. And only in 2004 did they introduce a question so you can disambiguate them, and therefore restricting our plot to that period. Nevertheless, you can see there are some movements, but mainly being the strong Republicans moving downwards, and maybe this one should just stay constant. So if we average across the years, we get this pattern, which is less extreme than before, but still we see that the extreme liberals are in the strong Democrats, are in the top, but not impressively so. They have 103 or something like this. And the various white Republicans have slightly above 100 IQ. Now, the weird thing is how the Democrats are below average, but the strong Democrats are above, and even the weak Democrats are above. So I don't know who these Democrats are. The ones who merely say they're Democratic is a strange non-linear and non-monotonic pattern here. The independents are also low, even just limited to the white people. Still, we can also simplify and can say, let's look at all the Democrat supporters and all the Republican supporters among only white people. And if you do that, then the gap is less than 1 point and basically uninteresting. There's not much difference there. Thus, to summarize these results, depending on whether you look at political ideology or political party, the gaps can reverse in the general population, but they're not impressively large. If you look only on the white people, you can see that really the non-white voters, so the blacks and Hispanics, they are dragging down the Democrat average. And if you ignore them, then the Democrats are also slightly smarter than the Republicans, which is the opposite of what you see in the general population, because they were dragging them down. So really, though, generally speaking, the gap sizes are not impressively large, with the exception of the one analysis where you look at only white people and you look at political ideology and you compare the extremes. Then the white extreme liberals have IQs of 107 or so, compared to the 98 or so of the extreme conservatives. So essentially, the extreme conservatives are average intelligence and the extreme liberals are somewhat elevated. But ideology is really more complicated than just one dimension. And I know most studies really just use one dimension, and they really normally just ask people one question or 4 questions. But if you take a look at political ideology, you would find that actually a one-dimensional model does not explain the data very well, and you should use at least 2 dimensions. And that's also what the typical political compass is based on. That one is based on having a social dimension and an economic dimension. And so on the economic dimension, you can have more or less freedom. More freedom means less state. And the same with the social, you can have more permissiveness, so more freedom as well. So that would mean legalized abortions and legalized drugs and whatever, legalize everything essentially, gay marriage, whatever. The thing is that these 2 dimensions, the freedom direction correlate with intelligence, both of them. And so the social liberals, the ones who are kind of pro more freedom socially, are smarter than people who are against such freedoms. And that is also true for people who want a smaller or a government that's less involved in politics, or sorry, in economics. And so both of these directions indicate higher intelligence. And so that would essentially mean that people who are pro-freedom in both, that is to say the libertarians, they would be particularly high intelligence, which is usually what my stereotype would be. In fact, Noah Kahl showed in this study that if you take the principal component of these 2 political dimensions, this principal component correlates 0.4 with intelligence, which is very high, which would also tell you that the people who are against freedom in both domains, so people who want a big state and they also want a lot of social restrictions, so kind of these boomer retiree type people, kind of it's like pensionist nationalist type that you have in Scandinavia, they would tend to be very low intelligence, at least insofar as the American data suggest, because they would be the opposite group of the libertarians. They would be in the bottom left of the political compass. And finally, we can say in Hanani, in fairness to him, when he's talking about how the conservatives are stupid, he doesn't really mean the typical voting conservative or the typical American Christian conservative. He's really talking about the conservative elites. And if you look at the conservative elites over time, they don't seem to have any political plan. Once in a while, they get a good leader like Reagan or Margaret Thatcher, and then they basically implement a lot of reforms that liberate sectors of the economy, and then they have economic growth. And this is all fine and dandy, but in the background, the leftists, they keep taking over universities, they keep taking over the media, all the organizations that staff smart people who kind of have a big say in the public debate. They get taken over, Sullivan Law type stuff, by the leftists, and the conservative elites didn't do anything against this. When they were in power for many decades, they did nothing, right? They didn't, in countries that have public media. Why did they not make sure that the media was balanced? Why is I guess in the US, the NPR or whatever, why is it so left-wing? If it's sponsored by the public, then obviously it should be centrist, but it's not, it's highly leftist. And it's the same thing in Denmark. We have the thing called Danish radio, which is, the original Danish media back when there was no competition. It's always been state subsidized. In fact, you pay for this over the tax now. And if you do surveys or analysis of the Danish media, you see that the Danish radio, which also produces television and newspaper stuff, they're super leftist compared even to the other media. So why is it that the conservatives, when they had power in Denmark, why did they not pull funding from this legacy stuff that just funds their enemies? I don't get it. They must be stupid, right? That's sort of, they don't really seem to have a grand plan about this. They just kind of try to make themselves look good. And when they lose, they say, oh, at least I have the moral high ground. And then they keep losing. Once in a while, they take power, they do some economic reforms, and then they lose again. But there's no grand plan. They just appear to like losing. So in that sense, you could say that they seem to have a stupid strategy, or the elites are stupid. That's what Hanania is talking about. And that's certainly true. It looks to me that way. But insofar as the average voters are concerned, it is not really the case. And it's very much more complicated. This comparison gives this result, this other comparison, different result. If you do two dimensions instead of one dimension, you get some different results. Different years can give you different results. There's really no simple summary of those results. So I hope you have learned a bit about intelligence and ideology, at least in America. See you.